Margaret came to the same park every morning at 9 a.m. sharp, sitting on the same bench. For 40 years, she had been watching the same man, carrying the same hope. The neighbors called her the crazy lady. But when they discovered who that man really was after 40 years, everyone was shocked. The morning sun filtered through the ancient oak trees of Riverside Park in Manhattan, casting long shadows across the walking paths as Margaret Sullivan made her way to bench number 47. It was 8:58 a.m. on a Tuesday in September 2023, and at 75 years old, Margaret moved with the careful precision of someone who had performed this exact routine for 40 years. She wore a simple navy blue coat, well-maintained but clearly from another decade, and carried a worn leather purse that had seen countless seasons. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and despite her age, her green eyes held a clarity and determination that spoke of someone still very much engaged with the world around her. Margaret had been coming to this same bench, at this same time, every single day since 1983. Rain or shine, through snowstorms and heat waves, during personal tragedies and small celebrations, she maintained her vigil. The bench sat at the perfect vantage point overlooking the park's maintenance building, where the groundskeeping crew gathered each morning to receive their assignments for the day. As Margaret settled onto her bench and arranged her coat, she checked her small gold watch, a gift from decades past that she wound carefully each evening, 9 a.m. exactly, right on schedule. And there he was. Frank Rodriguez emerged from the maintenance building just as he had every weekday morning for the past 15 years. At 68, he moved with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who took pride in his work but no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. His graying hair was hidden beneath a Parks Department cap, and his weathered hands spoke of decades spent working outdoors. Margaret watched as Frank checked the work roster posted outside the building, gathered his tools, and headed toward the rose garden that had become his specialty over the years. She had memorized his routine as completely as she had memorized her own. To the casual observer, Margaret appeared to be simply an elderly woman enjoying a peaceful morning in the park. But to those who frequented Riverside Park regularly, the joggers, the dog walkers, the parents pushing strollers, Margaret had become something of a fixture. They had noticed her consistency, her daily presence, and more than a few had developed theories about why she came. Some thought she was feeding pigeons, though they never saw her with birdseed. Others assumed she was meeting friends, though she always sat alone. A few regulars had attempted conversation over the years, but Margaret was polite yet distant, never revealing why she spent 3 hours each morning watching the park maintenance crew go about their business. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than any of them could have imagined. At 9:15, just as she had for 40 years, Margaret opened her leather purse and withdrew a small, faded photograph. The edges were worn from decades of handling, and the colors had shifted with age, but the image was still clear. A young man in his 20s with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple white button-down shirt, standing next to a young woman with auburn hair and the same green eyes that Margaret still possessed. Margaret studied the photograph for a few moments, as she did every morning, then looked up to watch Frank as he pruned the late-blooming roses with careful attention to each bush. She had been watching him work for 15 years now, and she knew his patterns, his preferences, the way he talked gently to the plants as if they could hear him. What Frank didn't know, what no one in the park knew, was that Margaret wasn't watching him randomly. She was watching him because 40 years ago, someone who looked exactly like him had made her a promise. At 11:45, Margaret would pack up her photograph, check her watch one final time, and make her way home to her small apartment 6 blocks away. She would return the next morning at 8:58, and the cycle would begin again. The neighbors in her building had long since given up trying to understand Margaret's daily routine. Mrs. Chen from 4B occasionally asked if Margaret was feeling well, noting that she seemed to spend an awful lot of time just sitting around. Mr. Patterson from the ground floor had once jokingly suggested that Margaret might be conducting surveillance for the police, which had earned him a sharp look and no response. Behind her back, and sometimes not so far behind it, they called her eccentric, obsessive. The nicer ones said she was set in her ways. The less charitable ones whispered that she was losing her grip on reality. that she was one of those old ladies who talks to herself. But Margaret wasn't talking to herself. She was talking to a memory, to a promise, to the possibility that someday, after 40 years of waiting, she might finally understand why the most important person in her life had simply vanished without explanation. The story had begun in 1983, when Margaret was 35 years old and working as a librarian at the Columbia University Law Library. She had been a different person then. Confident, social, planning a future that seemed as solid and predictable as the legal texts she cataloged each day. But on a Tuesday morning in October 1983, Margaret's life had taken a turn that she was still trying to understand 4 decades later. And it all centered around a man who had promised to meet her on bench number 47 in Riverside Park, and who had never shown up. At least, that's what Margaret had believed for 40 years. October 15, 1983 had been one of those perfect autumn days in New York City, when the leaves were at their peak color and the air carried just enough chill to make walking a pleasure rather than a chore. Margaret Sullivan, then 35 and at the height of her career as head librarian at Columbia's Law Library, had been looking forward to her lunch break all morning. She was supposed to meet David Chen, no relation to her current neighbor Mrs. Chen, at their usual spot in Riverside Park. David was a graduate student in engineering, 3 years younger than Margaret, with an earnest smile and a way of explaining complex concepts that made her feel both intelligent and cherished. They had been dating for 8 months, and Margaret had begun to suspect that David was working up the courage to propose. There had been hints, conversations about the future that lingered a bit too long, questions about what kind of life she envisioned for herself, a new nervousness in his manner that suggested he was planning something significant. Margaret had arrived at bench number 47 at exactly noon as they had arranged. David was usually early for their dates, often bringing a book or a small gift, a flower from someone's garden, an interesting article he'd cut from a magazine, once a small seashell he'd found during a weekend trip to Long Island. But at 12:15, David still hadn't arrived. Margaret checked her watch, wondering if she had misremembered the time. At 12:30, she began to worry that something had happened, perhaps an emergency at the university, or a family crisis that had called him away suddenly. By 1 p.m., Margaret was genuinely concerned. David was many things, but unreliable wasn't one of them. In 8 months of dating, he had never been more than 5 minutes late for anything, and he had never failed to call if plans needed to change. Margaret waited until 1:30, then walked to the nearest payphone to call David's apartment. The phone rang and rang with no answer. She tried the engineering department office, but the secretary said David hadn't been in that day and wasn't expected until his evening lab session. Confused and increasingly worried, Margaret returned to work, planning to try calling David again that evening. But when she called his apartment at 7 p.m. and again at 9 p.m., there was still no answer. The next morning, Margaret called the engineering department again. This time, the secretary's response was different. "I'm sorry," the woman said, "but David Chen is no longer a student here. He withdrew from the program yesterday afternoon." Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Withdrew? But that's impossible. He was finishing his dissertation. He was supposed to graduate in the spring. "I'm sorry, but that's all the information I can provide. You might try contacting him directly." But there was no way to contact David directly. When Margaret went to his apartment building that evening, the landlord told her that David had moved out the night before, leaving no forwarding address. He had paid his rent through the end of the month and simply disappeared. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks trying to understand what had happened. She contacted David's advisor, who seemed as surprised as she was by his sudden departure. She reached out to mutual friends, but none of them had heard from David either. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but her librarian's salary couldn't stretch to cover such an expense. The only clue she had was something David had said during their last conversation. 3 days before he was supposed to meet her in the park, they had been walking along the Hudson River, talking about their future together, when David had suddenly become quiet and serious. "Margaret," he had said, stopping to face her directly, "if something ever happened, If I ever had to go away suddenly, would you wait for me?" Margaret had laughed, thinking it was a hypothetical question, or perhaps the beginning of a romantic gesture. "Of course I would wait. But nothing's going to happen. We're going to be fine." David had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Promise me, if I ever disappear, promise me you'll wait for me at our bench in the park. Every day at noon, I'll find you there." At the time, Margaret had thought it was sweet but unnecessary. Now, she wondered if David had been trying to tell her something important. So Margaret had begun waiting. Every day at noon, she sat on bench number 47, hoping David would appear with an explanation for his sudden disappearance. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years. Margaret's friends and family had initially been supportive, assuming she was going through a normal grieving process after an unexpected breakup. But as the months stretched on and Margaret continued her daily vigil, their concern had turned to frustration and then to worry about her mental health. "He's not coming back," her sister Patricia had said bluntly after Margaret had been waiting for 6 months. "Whatever happened, whatever reason he had for leaving, he's moved on with his life. You need to do the same." But Margaret couldn't move on because she couldn't accept that David had simply chosen to leave her without explanation. The David she knew, the man who brought her flowers and listened to her stories about difficult library patrons and talked for hours about their shared love of old movies, wouldn't have disappeared by choice. Something had happened to him, or something had forced him to leave, and until she knew what that something was, Margaret would keep waiting. The years had passed with agonizing slowness. Margaret had kept her job at the library until her retirement in 2015, but she had never married, never pursued other relationships, never stopped believing that someday David would return to explain what had happened in October 1983. Her daily routine had evolved over the decades. Originally, she had waited from noon until 2 p.m., matching the time she and David usually spent together during her lunch break. But after she retired, Margaret had shifted her schedule to morning hours, arriving at 9 a.m. when the park was quieter and she could observe more carefully. Because somewhere along the way, Margaret had begun to notice patterns in the park that she hadn't seen before. She had started paying attention to the maintenance workers, the regular visitors, the people who came and went with the same consistency she did. And 15 years ago, when Frank Rodriguez had been hired as part of the groundskeeping crew, Margaret had felt a jolt of recognition that she couldn't explain. Frank looked nothing like David. David had been tall and lean where Frank was shorter and broader. David had been clean-shaven where Frank wore a mustache. David had been Asian American where Frank was clearly Latino. But there was something in Frank's eyes, something in the way he moved, something in his careful attention to detail as he worked, that reminded Margaret so strongly of David that she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to notice him. For 15 years, Margaret had watched Frank work in the park, and for 15 years she had wondered if she was losing her mind or if the universe was trying to tell her something. It was a Thursday morning in late September when Margaret's 40-year routine was finally disrupted. She had arrived at bench number 47 at her usual time, settled into her familiar position, and withdrawn the faded photograph from her purse, as she had every morning for 4 decades. But as Margaret lifted the photograph to catch the morning light, a sudden gust of wind, the kind that often swept through Riverside Park without warning, snatched it from her fingers. Margaret gasped and tried to grab the photograph, but the wind carried it several feet away, tumbling it across the walking path toward the maintenance building where Frank was just beginning his daily routine. "No, no, no," Margaret whispered, rising from the bench as quickly as her 75-year-old body would allow. The photograph was the only physical reminder she had of her time with David, the only proof that those 8 perfect months had actually existed. Frank had just finished checking the day's work assignments when he noticed the small piece of paper skittering across the ground near his feet. Without thinking, he bent down and picked it up, intending to dispose of it in the nearest trash bin. But as he straightened up, Frank caught sight of the image on the paper, and his world suddenly stopped. The photograph showed a young man and woman standing together, smiling at the camera with the easy affection of people deeply in love. The woman had auburn hair and bright green eyes. The man had dark hair and kind eyes and a smile that Frank recognized because he had seen it in the mirror every morning for 68 years. The man in the photograph was Frank himself, 45 years younger. Frank's hands began to shake as he studied the image more carefully. There was no mistake. The face looking back at him from the faded photograph was undeniably his own, taken sometime in what must have been the early 1980s based on the clothing and hairstyles. But Frank had no memory of this photograph being taken. He had no memory of the woman standing beside him, despite her striking eyes and warm smile. In fact, Frank had no clear memories of much of anything from the early 1980s, a fact that had puzzled him for decades, but which he had learned to live with. "Excuse me," said a soft voice behind him. "I believe that's mine." Frank turned to find an elderly woman approaching him, moving carefully but with obvious urgency. She had silver hair and green eyes that were remarkably similar to those of the woman in the photograph, though aged by 40 years. "I'm so sorry," Frank said, extending the photograph toward her. "The wind blew it over here. I was just going to." He stopped mid-sentence as he got a closer look at the woman's face. The bone structure, the shape of her eyes, the set of her mouth, they were identical to the woman in the photograph. Margaret reached for the photograph but hesitated when she saw Frank's expression. He was staring at her with a mixture of confusion and recognition that made her pulse quicken. Do I know you?" Frank asked slowly. Margaret's heart began to race. This was the moment she had been waiting for, hoping for, dreading for 40 years. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said carefully. "I come to this park every day. I've been watching you work here for 15 years. Frank's frown deepened. "Watching me? Why?" Margaret looked down at the photograph in her hands, then back up at Frank's face. The resemblance was unmistakable now that she was seeing him up close. The eyes were the same, the basic bone structure was the same, even the way he tilted his head when he was confused was exactly the same. "Because," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you look exactly like someone I used to know, someone who disappeared 40 years ago." Frank felt a strange sensation, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "What was his name? The person you knew?" "David Chen," Margaret said. We were going to be married." The name hit Frank like a physical blow. He had heard it before, in dreams that felt more like memories, in fragments of thoughts that surfaced when he wasn't paying attention. But he had always dismissed these flashes as imagination, because according to every document he possessed, every official record, his name was Frank Rodriguez, and it always had been. "I need to sit down," Frank said, looking around for the nearest bench. Margaret guided him to bench number 47, the same bench where she had spent every morning for 40 years. They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to process what was happening. "Can you tell me about David?" Frank asked finally. "About what he was like, what he did for work." Margaret studied Frank's face, looking for any sign that he was playing some kind of cruel joke. But there was nothing but genuine confusion and a desperate need to understand in his expression. David was an engineering graduate student at Columbia. Margaret began. He was brilliant, but not arrogant about it. He was kind and patient, and he loved to work with his hands. He was always fixing things, building things. He said it helped him think. Frank nodded slowly. "I've always been good with mechanical things. Always felt drawn to working outdoors, working with growing things." "David used to say that plants were just biological machines," Margaret continued. "He said understanding how they worked was the same as understanding any other kind of engineering problem." "I've been saying that to people for years," Frank whispered. "The other maintenance workers think I'm crazy. But I've always believed plants respond to being treated with the same precision you'd use on any complex system." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "David, is it really you?" Frank shook his head helplessly. "I don't know. I want to say no because my name is Frank Rodriguez and I've lived in New York my entire life. And I've never heard of Columbia University engineering program. But I've been having dreams about a woman with green eyes for as long as I can remember. Dreams about promises I made that I couldn't keep. Dreams about being separated from someone I loved and not being able to find my way back to them. Margaret pulled out the photograph again and held it where Frank could see it clearly. This was taken in October 1983, 3 days before you were supposed to meet me in this park. You never showed up. You disappeared completely, left your apartment, dropped out of school, vanished without a trace. Frank stared at the photograph, and for a moment Margaret could swear she saw recognition flash across his face. "I remember this day," he said slowly. "Not clearly, but I remember feeling happy, hopeful, like something wonderful was about to happen." "You were going to propose," Margaret said softly. "I think you were planning to ask me to marry you." Frank closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. "I get headaches sometimes, bad ones. They started when I was in my 20s, around 1983 or 1984. The doctors said it was probably stress-related, but I could never figure out what I was stressed about." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. "David, what happened to you? Where have you been for 40 years? "I don't know," Frank said. "I honestly don't know. My earliest clear memory is from 1985, when I was working construction in Queens. I had identification that said I was Frank Rodriguez, I had a social security number, I had a work history that went back several years. But I couldn't remember any of it." "You had amnesia." "That's what the doctors said. They thought I might have had a head injury or some kind of psychological trauma. But without knowing what had happened, they couldn't do much to help me recover my memories." Margaret reached out tentatively and touched Frank's hand. "So you've been living as Frank Rodriguez for 40 years, not knowing you were really David Chen?" Frank turned his hand palm up and intertwined his fingers with Margaret's. The gesture felt natural, familiar, as if they had held hands thousands of times before. "I think so," he said. "But Margaret, even if I am David Chen, I'm not the same person you knew 40 years ago. I've lived an entire different life. I was married to someone else for 20 years. She died 5 years ago. I have children who know me as Frank Rodriguez. I can't just go back to being someone I don't remember." Margaret squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not asking you to go back to being someone else. I just want to understand what happened. I want to know why you disappeared, and whether the person you've become could ever care about the person I've become." Frank looked at Margaret, really looked at her, for the first time. Despite the 40 years that had passed, despite the silver hair and the lines around her eyes, she was still beautiful. More than that, she felt familiar in a way that went beyond physical resemblance to the woman in the photograph. "I'd like to try to find out," Frank said. "If you're willing to help me, I'd like to try to understand what happened to David Chen and what it means for Frank Rodriguez." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I'd been waiting 40 years for this conversation. I think I can wait a little longer while we figure out the rest." Over the next several weeks, Margaret and Frank, who had decided to keep using the name Frank until they understood more about what had happened, began the careful process of trying to reconstruct the missing pieces of David Chen's life. Margaret had kept everything from their relationship: letters David had written her, ticket stubs from movies they had seen together, even a small notebook where she had recorded details of their conversations that seemed important at the time. Looking through these mementos with Frank, Margaret was amazed by how many small details seemed to trigger flashes of recognition in him. "You used to draw these little diagrams when you were explaining something complicated," Margaret said, showing Frank a napkin covered with sketches David had made during a dinner conversation about bridge engineering. "You said you thought better when your hands were moving." Frank studied the diagrams, and Margaret could see understanding dawning in his eyes. "I still do this," he said. "When I'm planning garden layouts or figuring out irrigation systems, I always sketch them out first. My coworkers tease me about it, say most people just use computers now." They visited Columbia University together, where Margaret hoped someone in the engineering department might remember David or have records that could help explain his sudden departure. But 40 years was a long time, and most of the faculty from 1983 had retired or moved on to other institutions. However, the university registrar was able to confirm that David Chen had indeed been a graduate student in good standing until October 16, 1983, when he had officially withdrawn from the program. The record showed that his dissertation advisor had noted David's withdrawal as unexpected and, quote, for personal reasons. Personal reasons, Frank mused as they walked away from the registrar's office. I wonder what that could have meant. Margaret had been wondering the same thing for 40 years. David, in our last conversation, you asked me to promise that if you ever disappeared, I would wait for you at the park. You said you would find me there. It was almost like you knew something was going to happen. Frank stopped walking. What if I was in some kind of trouble? What if I disappeared because I had to, not because I wanted to? That possibility had occurred to Margaret many times over the years, but she had never had any evidence to support it. What kind of trouble could you have been in? You were a graduate student. You didn't have any enemies. You weren't involved in anything dangerous. Maybe not, as David Chen, Frank said slowly. But what if David Chen was involved in something I didn't know about? Or what if someone wanted David Chen to disappear? This line of thinking led them to the New York Public Library, where Margaret's research skills proved invaluable. She showed Frank how to search through newspaper archives from October 1983, looking for any stories that might be connected to David's disappearance. They found several interesting possibilities. October 1983 had been a time of significant political tension, with ongoing conflicts in Central America that had spilled over into activism on college campuses. There had also been a major federal investigation into organized crime in New York, with several high-profile arrests that month. Look at this, Margaret said, pointing to a newspaper article dated October 17, 1983. Federal agents arrested 15 people in connection with a money laundering operation that allegedly used Columbia University students as unwitting couriers. Frank read the article carefully. It says here that the operation targeted graduate students in technical fields, particularly engineering and computer science, because they frequently traveled between universities for conferences and research collaborations. David traveled a lot for his research, Margaret said. He was working on some kind of transportation infrastructure project that involved visiting other cities to study different bridge and tunnel systems. They spent hours reading through related articles, piecing together what appeared to be a complex criminal enterprise that had used graduate students to transport money and documents between cities without the students' knowledge. The investigation had been ongoing for months before the arrests in October 1983. What if David found out he was being used, Frank suggested. What if he discovered that his research trips were actually cover for illegal activities? Margaret felt a chill of recognition. He was acting strange those last few weeks, nervous, distracted. He kept asking me odd questions about whether I would wait for him, whether I trusted him completely. I thought he was just nervous about proposing, but what if he was scared? If he had stumbled onto evidence of criminal activity, and if the people involved knew he had discovered their operation? Frank didn't finish the sentence, but they both understood the implications. They would have wanted him to disappear, Margaret said quietly, permanently. Frank nodded grimly. But what if David was smarter than they gave him credit for? What if he found a way to disappear on his own terms, before they could silence him permanently? This theory led them to their next breakthrough. Margaret remembered that David had mentioned having a friend who worked in social services, someone he had met through a volunteer program at Columbia. If David had needed help creating a new identity quickly, this friend might have been able to provide resources or contacts. After several days of searching through old Columbia volunteer program records, they found a name, Carmen Rodriguez, who had worked for the New York Department of Social Services in 1983 and had been involved in programs that helped crime victims and witnesses obtain new identities for their protection. Carmen Rodriguez, it turned out, was still alive and living in a nursing home in Brooklyn. When Margaret called to ask if they could visit, Carmen's response was immediate and telling, "Is this about David Chen? I've been wondering when someone would finally come asking about him." Carmen Rodriguez was 89 years old, but her mind was sharp, and her memory of the events of October 1983 was crystal clear. When Margaret and Frank visited her at the Sunset Manor nursing home in Brooklyn, Carmen took one look at Frank and smiled. "Hello, David," she said simply. "I've been wondering how you were doing all these years." Frank felt a jolt of recognition that was stronger than anything he had experienced so far. "You know me. You really know me." Carmen nodded. "You came to me in October 1983, scared out of your mind and begging for help. You said people were trying to kill you and you needed to disappear completely." Margaret gripped Frank's hand tightly. "What exactly happened?" Carmen settled back in her chair, her expression growing serious. David had discovered that his research advisor, Professor Martin Kellner, was using graduate students to courier money for a criminal organization. The students thought they were transporting legitimate research materials between universities, but they were actually carrying laundered money and coded messages. Frank leaned forward intently. "How did I find out?" "You told me that you had noticed inconsistencies in your travel expenses," Carmen continued. "When you started asking questions, you realized that the amounts you were being reimbursed didn't match the actual costs of your trips. You did some investigating and discovered that Professor Kellner was billing the university for much larger amounts than what the students were actually spending." Margaret's eyes widened. So David was naturally curious and good with numbers. That's exactly like him. David dug deeper and found evidence that Professor Kellner was skimming money from research grants and using graduate students to move the stolen funds between bank accounts in different cities, Carmen said. But when David confronted Kellner about what he had discovered, Kellner panicked. Frank felt fragments of memory beginning to surface, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle clicking into place. He threatened me. "Professor Kellner told me that if I reported what I had found, the people he was working with would make sure I never had the chance to testify against anyone." Carmen nodded approvingly. "Your memory is coming back. That's good." "Kellner gave you 24 hours to decide whether you wanted to keep quiet and continue being an unknowing courier, or whether you wanted to disappear permanently. So I came to you," Frank said, the memories becoming clearer. "I remembered you from the volunteer program, and I knew you worked with people who needed new identities." "You were terrified," Carmen said, "not just for yourself, but for Margaret. You said that Kellner had made it clear that anyone close to you would also be in danger if you tried to expose the operation." Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "So you disappeared to protect me." Frank turned to look at her, and in his eyes she could see the David she had fallen in love with 40 years ago. "I couldn't bear the thought of you being hurt because of something I had discovered. Carmen helped me create a new identity as Frank Rodriguez, her late husband's name, and I disappeared." "But why didn't you ever come back?" Margaret asked. "Why didn't you contact me once it was safe?" Carmen's expression grew sad. "That's the tragic part of this story. David was supposed to come back once the federal investigation was complete and Kellner was arrested. But something went wrong." Frank pressed his palms against his temples, trying to access memories that felt just out of reach. "The headaches, the memory loss. Something happened to me after I became Frank Rodriguez." Carmen nodded. "About 6 months after you disappeared, you were in a construction accident. A beam fell and hit you in the head. You were in a coma for 2 weeks, and when you woke up, you had no memory of being David Chen. You didn't remember Margaret. You didn't remember Professor Kellner. You didn't remember anything about why you had needed to disappear." Margaret gasped. "You had amnesia from a head injury, not from psychological trauma." "I tried to help you remember," Carmen continued. "I showed you the documents we had created for your new identity. I told you about David Chen and what had happened. But the doctors said that pushing too hard to recover traumatic memories could be dangerous. They recommended letting your brain heal naturally." Frank was quiet for several minutes, processing this information. "So I've been living as Frank Rodriguez for 40 years, not knowing that I was supposed to go back to being David Chen once it was safe." "Professor Kellner was arrested in January 1984, Carmen said. "The entire criminal operation was shut down. It would have been safe for you to reclaim your identity as David Chen, but by then, you didn't remember that David Chen had ever existed." Margaret wiped her tears with a tissue. And I spent 40 years waiting for someone who literally couldn't remember that he was supposed to come back to me." Carmen reached out and took Margaret's hand. "I thought about contacting you myself, but I didn't know how to explain what had happened without potentially putting you in danger. And as the years passed, David Frank seemed to be building a good life for himself. He got married, had children, found work he enjoyed. I wasn't sure it would be kind to disrupt that, especially when there was no guarantee his memories would ever return." Frank looked at Margaret with a mixture of grief and wonder. "You waited 40 years for me to keep a promise I couldn't remember making." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I knew you wouldn't have disappeared by choice. I knew something must have happened to you. I just never imagined it was something this complicated." Carmen smiled at them both. But here's the beautiful part of this story. Even without his memories, Frank was drawn back to the park where David had promised to meet you. He took a job maintaining the very place where you were waiting for him. Some part of him, some part that survived even the amnesia, was still trying to keep that promise. Frank stared at Carmen in amazement. "I always felt drawn to Riverside Park. When the position with Parks Department became available 15 years ago, I applied immediately, even though I had no experience with landscaping. I just felt like I belonged there." "And you specialized in maintaining the area around bench number 47, Margaret added, her voice filled with wonder. Frank nodded slowly. "I always felt peaceful working in that section of the park. I never knew why." Carmen looked back and forth between them. "So the question now is, what do you want to do with this information? Frank, you have a life and an identity as Frank Rodriguez. Margaret, you've spent 40 years waiting for David Chen, but neither of you is the same person you were in 1983. Margaret and Frank looked at each other, both realizing that Carmen was asking them to make a decision that would affect the rest of their lives. Over the following weeks, Margaret and Frank met regularly to continue exploring Frank's recovering memories and to get to know each other as the people they had become. It was a delicate process, balancing Frank's need to understand his past with his commitment to the family and identity he had built as Frank Rodriguez. Frank's adult children, Maria, 35, and Carlos, 32, were initially shocked to learn about their father's hidden history. But they were also relieved to finally have an explanation for some of their father's quirks and behaviors that had never quite made sense. "Dad always seemed like he was carrying some kind of sadness," Maria told Margaret when they met for coffee. "He was a wonderful father, don't get me wrong, but there was always this sense that he was missing something important. Mom used to say it was like he was homesick for a place he couldn't remember." Carlos nodded in agreement. "And he was always so careful about security, about making sure we knew where each other were at all times. We thought he was just overprotective, but now it makes sense. Some part of him remembered what it was like to have someone you love just disappear." Margaret was moved by the Rodriguez family's acceptance of her and their father's complicated history. Frank's late wife, Rosa, had been gone for 5 years, and both children expressed hope that their father might find happiness again. Rosa always said that Dad loved her completely, but that she felt like she was competing with a ghost, Maria confided. She would have been happy to know that the ghost was real, and that Dad finally found his way back to her. But integration of Frank's two identities was more complex than simply choosing between David Chen and Frank Rodriguez. His memories of being David were returning in fragments, emotional impressions, sensory details, and relationship patterns that felt familiar but weren't always connected to specific events. "I remember how you laugh," Frank told Margaret one afternoon as they walked through the rose garden he had maintained for 15 years. "I remember that you have a very particular way of tilting your head when you're thinking about something serious. I remember that you used to read to me sometimes, and that I loved the sound of your voice even more than the stories." Margaret felt her heart constrict with both joy and sadness. "I remember all of that too. But Frank, I need you to know that I don't expect you to be the same person David was 40 years ago. We're both different people now." Frank stopped walking and took Margaret's hands in his. "What if we tried to build something new? Not trying to recapture what David and Margaret had, but discovering what Frank and Margaret might have together." It was a conversation they had been building toward for weeks, and Margaret felt both excitement and terror at the possibility. "Are you sure? You've been Frank Rodriguez for 40 years. That's not an identity you can just set aside." "I don't want to set it aside," Frank said. "Frank Rodriguez has a family, a career, a life that I'm proud of. But Frank Rodriguez has also been incomplete for 40 years, and now I know why. I need both parts of myself to be whole." Margaret studied his face, looking for any sign of uncertainty. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Frank smiled, and Margaret could see both David and Frank in that expression. "I'm suggesting that a 75-year-old retired librarian and a 68-year-old park groundskeeper might have some beautiful years ahead of them, if they're brave enough to find out." Margaret felt tears of happiness welling up in her eyes. "Are you asking me on a date, Frank Rodriguez?" "I'm asking you to marry me, Margaret Sullivan," Frank said, his voice steady and sure. "I know it's crazy, and I know we have a lot to figure out, but I've already lost 40 years with you. I don't want to waste any more time." Margaret laughed through her tears, remembering David's impulsive romantic gestures and recognizing them in Frank's proposal. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning in Riverside Park, Margaret Sullivan became Margaret Rodriguez in a ceremony that brought together the threads of 2 lifetimes. The wedding took place near bench number 47, surrounded by the rose garden that Frank had lovingly maintained for 15 years. Margaret wore a simple cream-colored dress that complemented her silver hair, and Frank wore a dark suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. Frank's children served as witnesses, along with Carmen Rodriguez, who had traveled from Brooklyn to see the love story she had helped make possible. Several of Margaret's former colleagues from the Columbia Library attended, amazed by the fairy tale ending to a story they had watched unfold with concern for decades. The ceremony was officiated by Father Martinez from the local Catholic Church, who had counseled Frank and Margaret through the complex process of blending their histories and planning their future together. 40 years ago, Father Martinez said in his homily, Margaret and Frank made promises to each other that circumstances prevented them from keeping. Today, they make new promises, not as the young people they once were, but as the wise, experienced individuals they have become. When it came time for vows, Margaret spoke first. "Frank, I promised David 40 years ago that I would wait for him, and I did. But I'm not marrying David today. I'm marrying you." Frank Rodriguez, the man who kept his promise even when he couldn't remember making it. The man who found his way back to me through 40 years of separation and amnesia and loss. I love who you were, and I love who you've become, and I love who we might become together. Frank's vows were simple but deeply felt. Margaret, I lost 40 years of memories, but I never lost the feeling that I was supposed to be somewhere else, with someone else. You were that someone. You were the missing piece I couldn't name. I can't give you back the 40 years we lost, but I can promise you that every day we have left will be filled with the love I've been carrying for you, even when I didn't know your name. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that Frank had chosen to complement the engagement ring Margaret had never stopped wearing, the sun broke through the morning clouds and bathed the garden in golden light. After the ceremony, the small wedding party moved to a nearby restaurant for lunch. Margaret and Frank sat together, holding hands and marveling at the surreal experience of finally being married after waiting 40 years. "Do you think David and Margaret would approve?" Margaret asked quietly. Frank squeezed her hand. "I think David and Margaret would be amazed that their love was strong enough to survive everything that tried to destroy it." Maria Rodriguez, now Maria Rodriguez Thompson, stood to give a toast. "When my father told us about Margaret and about David Chen, my first reaction was confusion. How could my dad be someone completely different? But as I've gotten to know Margaret, I've realized that she doesn't want my father to be someone different. She loves him exactly as he is. And that's how I know this marriage is going to be wonderful." Carmen Rodriguez, the woman who had helped save David's life 40 years earlier, was the last to speak. "I've learned a lot about love in my 89 years, but Frank and Margaret have taught me something new. Real love doesn't just survive tragedy. It transforms tragedy into something beautiful. David Chen and Margaret Sullivan were separated by circumstances they couldn't control. But Frank Rodriguez and Margaret Rodriguez found each other despite 40 years of obstacles. And that's a kind of miracle. Margaret and Frank settled into married life with the contentment of people who understood the value of second chances. They kept Frank's apartment, which was larger and had better light, but Margaret brought her books and her photographs and the carefully preserved mementos of her relationship with David. Frank continued working for the Parks Department, though he reduced his hours to part-time. At 68, he was eligible for partial retirement, and he wanted more time to spend with Margaret and to continue exploring his recovered memories. Margaret, meanwhile, discovered that retirement was much more enjoyable when shared with someone she loved. She began volunteering at the Columbia Library again, helping with a project to digitize historical documents. The work gave her a sense of purpose and connected her to the career she had loved. But their greatest joy came from the simple daily routines they established together. Each morning, Frank and Margaret walked to Riverside Park together, not to sit on bench number 47 in solitary waiting, but to enjoy the beauty of the place where they had found each other again. Frank showed Margaret the details of his work, how to identify different rose varieties, the best times to water various plants, the intricate ecosystem that supported the park's wildlife. Margaret shared her love of books with Frank, reading aloud to him in the evenings just as she had 40 years earlier. "You know," Frank said one evening, as Margaret finished reading a chapter from a mystery novel they were enjoying together, "some of my memories from being David are still fuzzy, but this, sitting with you, listening to your voice, this feels exactly the same as it did 40 years ago." Margaret smiled and closed the book. Some things don't change, even when everything else does. They also began exploring New York City together, visiting places that Frank had never seen despite living in the city his entire adult life. As David, he had been focused on his studies and hadn't taken much time for tourism. As Frank, he had been busy working and raising children. But as Margaret and Frank, they had the time and curiosity to discover their city together. They visited museums, attended concerts, took weekend trips to explore the Hudson Valley and Long Island. Margaret delighted in Frank's engineer's perspective on bridges and tunnels, while Frank appreciated Margaret's librarian's knowledge of history and culture. 6 months after their wedding, they received an unexpected phone call that would add another layer to their already complex story. "Mr. Rodriguez? This is Detective Sarah Kim with the NYPD Cold Case Unit. I'm calling because we're reopening an investigation into the disappearance of David Chen in 1983, and we understand you may have information about this case." Frank and Margaret looked at each other, realizing that their private resolution of a 40-year-old mystery was about to become public in a way they hadn't anticipated. "Detective Kim," Frank said carefully, "I think you should know that David Chen is no longer missing. I should know, because I am David Chen." The reopening of the David Chen case had been triggered by the death of Professor Martin Kellner, who had passed away in federal prison 3 months earlier while serving a sentence for an unrelated financial fraud conviction. Before his death, Kellner had confessed to his role in the 1983 money laundering operation and had provided details about several unsolved cases, including the disappearance of David Chen. Detective Sarah Kim was a 38-year-old specialist in cold cases who had built her career on solving mysteries that other investigators had given up on. When she met with Frank and Margaret to take their statements, she was both amazed by their story and impressed by the detailed records Margaret had kept over the 40 years. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Detective Kim said, reviewing Margaret's carefully organized files, "you've done better detective work than most professionals. These records, combined with Mr. Rodriguez's recovered memories and Carmen Rodriguez's testimony, give us enough evidence to finally close this case officially." Frank found the process of giving his statement both therapeutic and unsettling. For the first time in 40 years, he was able to tell the complete story of what had happened to David Chen, integrating his recovered memories with the documented evidence of Professor Kellner's criminal activities. "The irony," Frank told Detective Kim, "is that if I hadn't had the amnesia, I probably would have spent the last 40 years looking over my shoulder, wondering if Kellner's associates were still looking for me. Instead, I was able to live a normal, happy life as Frank Rodriguez." Detective Kim nodded thoughtfully. According to our records, the criminal organization that Kellner was working with was completely dismantled by 1985. You would have been safe to reclaim your identity as David Chen by then, but of course, you couldn't remember that David Chen existed. The detective's investigation also revealed several other graduate students who had been unknowing couriers in Kellner's operation. Two of them had also disappeared around the same time as David, though neither had been as fortunate in creating a new life. Your case is actually going to help us solve two other missing persons cases from 1983, Detective Kim told them. The families of these other students have been waiting for answers just as long as you were, Mrs. Rodriguez. Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her 40 years of waiting and hoping might help bring closure to other families who had experienced similar mysteries and losses. The official resolution of the David Chen case also brought some unexpected financial benefits. Columbia University, acknowledging their failure to protect David from Professor Kellner's criminal activities, offered a settlement that included full payment of David's tuition and living expenses from 1983, with 40 years of accumulated interest. "We don't need the money," Margaret told Frank when they received the settlement offer. "We've both lived modestly for so long, we wouldn't know what to do with that much money." Frank smiled. "I have some ideas about what we could do with it." 1 year after their wedding, Frank and Margaret Rodriguez established the David Chen Foundation, dedicated to helping families of missing persons and supporting research into memory-related trauma recovery. The foundation's offices were housed in a renovated building near Columbia University, and its staff included Carmen Rodriguez as an honorary board member, Detective Sarah Kim as a law enforcement consultant, and several social workers who specialized in helping people navigate complex identity and family reunification issues. "We can't give people back their lost years," Margaret explained to a reporter from the New York Times, who was writing a feature story about the foundation. "But we can help them make the most of whatever time they have left, and we can support other families who are still searching for answers." The foundation's work took several forms. They provided financial assistance for private investigators working on missing persons cases, funded research into traumatic amnesia recovery, and created support groups for families dealing with unexplained disappearances. But perhaps most importantly, they established a database and communication network that helped connect families with missing loved ones to resources and information that might help resolve their cases. Frank, drawing on his experience as both a missing person and someone who had successfully built a new life after trauma, became a counselor and advocate for other amnesia patients. His engineering background proved useful in developing systematic approaches to memory recovery that respected both the need to heal and the importance of not forcing traumatic memories to return. Margaret, meanwhile, used her research and organizational skills to create comprehensive resources for families of missing persons. She understood better than most the importance of maintaining hope while also accepting the possibility that some questions might never be answered. "The thing about waiting 40 years for someone," Margaret told a support group of families dealing with long-term disappearances, "is that you learn to find meaning in the waiting itself. I built a life around the hope that David would return, and that life had value even when it seemed like the hope was misplaced." On the second anniversary of their wedding, Frank and Margaret returned to bench number 47 in Riverside Park, not to wait for someone who might never come, but to celebrate the miracle of finding each other again, despite impossible odds. "Do you ever regret the 40 years we lost?" Frank asked as they sat together watching the sun set over the Hudson River. Margaret considered the question seriously. "I regret that we lost the chance to build a family together when we were young. I regret that you had to live with amnesia and confusion for so long. I regret that Carmen had to carry the secret of what happened to you." She paused, then continued, "But I don't regret waiting for you. Those 40 years taught me things about patience and faith and the endurance of love that I might never have learned otherwise. And they led us to this moment, sitting here together as 77 and 70-year-olds who still have time to build something beautiful." Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "I have something for you." Margaret opened the package to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny photograph, the same image that had blown away in the wind 2 years earlier, but carefully restored and reprinted. "I wanted you to have the young David and Margaret with you always," Frank said. "But I also wanted you to remember that their love story didn't end when David disappeared. It just took 40 years to reach the next chapter." Margaret fastened the locket around her neck and kissed her husband. "What do you think the next chapter will be about?" Frank smiled and gestured toward the park around them, where families were playing, couples were walking hand in hand, and life was continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity. "I think it's going to be about two people who learned that love doesn't have an expiration date and who decided to make the most of every day they have left together." 5 years after their reunion, Margaret and Frank Rodriguez had become local celebrities in their neighborhood. Not because of their unusual love story, but because of the work they were doing through the David Chen Foundation. The foundation had helped resolve over 50 missing persons cases, reunited dozens of families, and provided support to hundreds of people dealing with trauma-related memory loss. Margaret, now 80 years old, served as the foundation's director, while Frank, at 73, had become a nationally recognized expert on amnesia recovery and identity reconstruction. Their marriage had deepened and strengthened as they worked together toward shared goals. The uncertainties and awkwardness of their reunion had given way to the comfortable partnership of two people who had learned to appreciate both their shared history and their individual growth. Frank's memories of being David had continued to return, but in manageable fragments that enriched rather than disrupted his sense of self. He could now remember specific conversations with Margaret from 1983, details of his engineering studies, and the fear he had felt when he realized his life was in danger. But he also maintained his connections to the life he had built as Frank Rodriguez. His children were now integral parts of Margaret's extended family, and his grandchildren, Maria's twin daughters and Carlos's son, called Margaret Abuela Margaret, and delighted in hearing the story of how their grandfather had forgotten who he was but found his way back to his true love anyway. Margaret had finally stopped visiting bench number 47 every morning, but not because she had given up hope or lost faith. She stopped because she no longer needed to wait. The person she had been waiting for was now making coffee in her kitchen each morning, reading the newspaper aloud to her, and planning their day together. On a sunny Tuesday morning in September 2028, exactly 45 years after David Chen had disappeared, Margaret and Frank Rodriguez sat together on their favorite bench in Riverside Park, watching Frank's great-granddaughter, Maria's daughter's new baby, sleep peacefully in her stroller. "5 generations of our family have been touched by this story now," Margaret said, gently rocking the stroller. "Do you think they'll understand what it means?" Frank adjusted his reading glasses and looked at the baby's peaceful face. "I think they'll understand that love is patient, that families can survive anything, and that sometimes the most important journeys take longer than we expect, but lead us exactly where we need to be." Margaret smiled and leaned against Frank's shoulder. "And if they ever forget, we'll tell them the story again." "The story of the woman who waited 40 years, Frank said. "And the man who found his way home," Margaret added. They sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the sounds of the park that had been the setting for their love story. Children playing, birds singing, the distant hum of the city that had sheltered them both through decades of separation and brought them back together when the time was right. Margaret no longer needed to carry the faded photograph in her purse because the love it represented was sitting right beside her. Frank no longer needed to wonder why he felt drawn to this particular corner of the park, because he understood now that some part of his heart had always known exactly where it belonged. As the sun climbed higher in the September sky, 3 generations of the Rodriguez family gathered around the bench for their weekly family picnic. The story of Margaret and Frank's reunion had become family legend, told and retold at birthdays and holidays and quiet Sunday afternoons. But more than a story, it had become a testament to the power of faith, patience, and the kind of love that transcends time, memory, and even identity itself. "Tell us again about the letter that blew away," 6-year-old Sofia Rodriguez asked as she climbed onto Frank's lap. "Tell us about the 40 years of waiting," added her 8-year-old brother Diego. Margaret and Frank looked at each other and smiled. They had told this story hundreds of times now, but it never got old, because each time they told it, they discovered new layers of meaning, new reasons to be grateful for the winding path that had led them back to each other. Once upon a time, Margaret began, there was a young woman who made a promise to wait for someone she loved. And as she spoke, surrounded by family and friends in the park where her vigil had finally ended, Margaret understood that some stories don't end when the waiting is over. Some stories just begin again, with new chapters written by children and grandchildren who carry the legacy of patience, faith, and enduring love into the future. As we come to the end of Margaret and Frank's incredible 40-year love story, I want you to stop for a moment and really think about what we've just witnessed. This isn't just a story about two people finding each other again. This is a story about the power of faith, the strength of true love, and the beautiful ways that the universe sometimes works to bring people back together when they're meant to be. Margaret Sullivan waited 40 years. 40 years. Think about that. Most people give up on love after 40 days, maybe 40 weeks if they're really committed. But Margaret? She held on to hope for 4 decades, sitting on the same bench every single morning, believing that somehow, some way, the man she loved would keep his promise to find her. And Frank, even when he couldn't remember his own name, even when amnesia had stolen his memories and a new identity had replaced his old life, some part of his soul was still drawn to that park. Some part of him was still trying to keep a promise he couldn't even remember making. That's not coincidence, my friends. That's destiny. But here's what I find most beautiful about their story. Margaret didn't just wait passively for 40 years. She built a life. She had a career she loved. She maintained her friendships, her dignity, her independence. She proved that you can hold space for love while still living fully. You can believe in tomorrow while making the most of today. And when they finally found each other again, they didn't try to pretend that 40 years hadn't passed. They didn't try to pick up where they left off as if nothing had happened. They honored who they had become during those decades apart, and they built something new together. Not a recreation of their young love, but a mature, deeper love that could only exist because they had both grown and changed. Frank and Margaret's story teaches us that love doesn't have an expiration date. It teaches us that some bonds are so strong they can survive amnesia, new identities, and 4 decades of separation. It teaches us that waiting for the right person isn't settling. It's believing that some connections are worth everything. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This is a beautiful story, but it's also incredibly rare. Most people who wait 40 years are just wasting their lives. And you know what? You might be right. Margaret's story could have ended differently. Frank might never have recovered his memories. They might never have found each other again. But here's the thing. Margaret's 40 years of waiting weren't wasted, even if Frank had never come back. Because those 40 years taught her about the depth of her own capacity for love, loyalty, and faith. They taught her that she was strong enough to build a meaningful life, even while carrying disappointment. They taught her that some things are worth believing in, even when belief is difficult. And for those of you watching this who are waiting for someone, whether it's an ex-partner you still love, a family member you've lost touch with, or someone you haven't met yet who you hope is out there, Margaret's story teaches us that there's a difference between healthy hope and destructive obsession. Margaret didn't let her waiting prevent her from living. She had a career, friends, interests, a full life. She held space for love while still being a complete person on her own. That's the kind of waiting that honors both yourself and the person you're hoping to find. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that miracles still happen and that true love really can survive anything, please hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in the power of patience, the strength of hope, and the possibility that their own love story might have a beautiful ending they haven't imagined yet. And if you know someone who's been waiting for love or searching for a lost connection, or wondering if it's worth holding on to hope for someone who seems to be gone forever, please share Margaret and Frank's story with them. Because sometimes we all need to be reminded that the universe has a sense of timing that's bigger than our understanding, and that the most beautiful reunions often happen when we least expect them. But most importantly, if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about the power of love to transcend time and distance, stories about faith rewarded and patience honored, stories about the beautiful ways that broken hearts can be made whole again, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We share new heartwarming stories every week that will restore your faith in love, remind you that miracles still happen, and prove that no matter how dark life gets, there's always reason to hope for a better tomorrow. Because here's what I believe with every fiber of my being. Somewhere out there, someone is waiting for you. Someone is holding space for you in their heart. Someone is believing in the possibility of your love story, even if they don't know your name yet. And maybe, just maybe, if you're patient enough, faithful enough, and brave enough to keep believing, your own 40-year wait, whether it's 40 days, 40 weeks, or 40 years, will end with the kind of reunion that makes every moment of waiting worth it. Margaret thought she was just a woman sitting on a bench, but she was so much more. She was a keeper of promises, a guardian of hope, a living testament to the power of love that never gives up. And you're not just whoever you think you are either. You're someone's missing piece. You're someone's answered prayer. You're someone's reason to keep believing that love stories don't always end when the waiting begins. Sometimes that's when they get interesting. So keep your hearts open, keep your faith strong, and never stop believing that your own beautiful ending might be just around the corner. Because love doesn't watch the clock, it doesn't count the years, and it never, ever gives up on the people it's meant to find. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. Thank you for believing in the power of love that transcends time and the beauty of promises kept, even when memory fails. Until next time, remember, you are worth waiting for, you are worth finding, and your love story isn't over yet. See you in the next story, where hearts find their way home and love proves once again that it's the strongest force in the universe.